All right, so welcome to class. This is going to be going over chapters 4 and 5, and I do have one student with us today, so thanks for being here. And um, chapter 4 was about kind of the research and how we get diagnoses, assessment, and in general study mental disorders. So it goes right along with the activity that was due on Sunday, the DSM-5 assignment. My dog is yipping for something. So, um, looking at dimensions of emotional states, cognitive and physical behavior, and then there are the categories defined by the frequently observed syndrome. So, categories such as anxiety, depression, trauma. And so those are the different categories and ways that we look at the different symptoms will be the dimensional, emotional, cognitive, and physical behaviors. The DSM-5, of course, most of you got familiar with that last week, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. It is our diagnosis manual. Uh, and the advantages of diagnosis is that it helps. When I say somebody has bipolar 2 disorder, we can all speak the same language. We can all look it up, and it gives us a list of the symptoms and um, ways of being when a person has or bipolar 2 disorder. So it's really easy to communicate with other professionals and individuals. So it provides standardized definitions and causes. They can assess most effective treatments, and so we understand certain treatments work better with certain diagnoses. And then it also helps researchers, clinicians, and lay people in just understanding the mental disorder in general. So diagnosis is an important aspect. Um, Assessing the behavior, there's the clinical assessment. So meeting with the clinician, doing an interview process usually, getting to know the person, where they're coming from, what their experiences have been. That all goes into that. Sometimes there are actual assessments which are being conducted, like Beck's depression, uh, and Beck's anxiety. So there are some different assessments that are being used to do that as well. You want to be careful not to use any one assessment and try to make a diagnosis off of that. Usually you'll want to have several assessments that are going in, as well as an interview process. Sometimes it's by the referral. For instance, substance abuse disorder, we often have a lot of referrals done in treatment from uh, judges and other courts. So um, procedures and measures, how we do the assessments and what we're measuring, and then of course the client's needs, so what they're presenting with and how we can help them best. So when it comes to research and things like that, we have the different types of reliability. There's test retest reliability, which is just you take the test at one point and at some other point you take the test again, and how consistent those answers are across individuals is how well there's reliability for that. Inter-rater reliability, I've done some research when I was at Cal State San Bernardino, working with my professors there. Um, I knew I was interested in doing research even from a bachelor's degree, so I was helping out and do some research from that. And one of the things that we did was research of observation of teachers and toddlers in a preschool environment. And we spent many hours and many days, many weeks actually, um, getting to the point where we had a really solid inter-rater reliability. It takes practice and in to see the same things that everybody else is seeing. So inter-rater reliability can be difficult to achieve sometimes. And then internal consistency reliability is there's a subset of questions often within a measure, and are those things measuring the same variable? And so that is within an assessment or within a test, questions are going to be measuring one aspect or one variable. Are they doing a good job of it? So if, for instance, if they're all measuring depression, then those particular questions should all be yes if there's depression present, or no. I'm kind of simplifying it, but I hope that you understand kind of where that's going from. Validity is probably a more important aspect in some ways. If there's not any validity, then it doesn't matter. You could have 100% reliability, but if you don't have any validity, then it doesn't matter, because the validity is, or how well do you measure what you're measuring. So if I have an assessment that's measuring depression, and it measures something else, then it doesn't do any good to measure depression, that instrument. So I would want to use something that's valid and reliable. Okay. So we've got different types. We've got content validity, how well the test or interview items adequately measure the variable construct of diagnosis. Predictive validity is how well does it actually predict something. So for instance, the ACT and the SAT scores that you may have had before coming into school, if you had really low scores, it would predict that you weren't going to do very well in school and that you needed some maybe more education in maybe math or reading or whatever. If you had really high scores, then it would suggest that you're going to do really well in school. And there are obviously exceptions to how well it predicts. I didn't do very well my first attempt at school, even though I scored a 27 on the ACT. And so even though my score would say that I was going to do really well in school, I didn't do very well because of other factors. And so I ended up joining the Marine Corps instead. Later on, when I matured, because that's one thing it doesn't assess is maturity level. When I matured, I was able to be successful in school. Concurrent validity, how well test scores or diagnoses correlate with a related but independent set of test scores or behaviors. So if I do Beck's depression inventory and then I have another assessment that also measures depression, then you would want both of those to be rather similar. Because if they are not, then one isn't measuring depression as well as the other. So there's no concurrent validity. And then the last thing, of course, is construct validity, how well test scores or diagnoses correlate with other measures or behaviors in a logical and theoretically consistent way. So the construct of depression, if I just took a survey of how you would describe the depression and how would you measure it, different people might come up with different ways. But if I took all those people and found all the similar ways, that would be some construct validity. Okay. Intelligence tests, can you find what's in this missing? We've got the tire over there. So, but interesting, when I was in California, and I'm not sure if they've changed it, but because of a bias, because most intelligence tests are conducted on white or Caucasian middle class Americans, the state of California actually banned the use of intelligence tests throughout the state for people of color. They said that it wasn't a valid way of conducting an intelligence test. So for a long period of time, those were outlawed because they were biased against people of color. A lot of times they're also biased against people in rural areas versus suburban or urban areas. So it's an interesting thing about how reliability and validity impact things like intelligence tests. Personality assessment, the MMPI-2, has long been used for, it's one of the oldest, I think, measures for personality. disorders in use. And so it's just for fun. We did that. We did that when I was in my master's program, and I turned out okay. So it is a really long test, though. A lot of questions and a lot of internal consistency within it, because there's a lot of measures measuring the same thing, a lot of questions measuring the same thing in different ways. Projective, so what do you see? And the thematic apperception test, the stories behind these, taking neutral things, and how people project, or what they project on those neutral activities. So behavioral assessment, observation. Definitely when we get to behavior, there's a lot of observation. Since behavioral therapy is often one of the biggest things used in schools, they have people who are really well versed in behavioral assessment. Biological assessment, CAT scans, PET scans, etc. Looking at genetic therapy even now today. So it's amazing how far we've come as far as biological assessments. Psychophysiological assessments, so evaluating the bodily changes possibly associated with certain mental conditions, looking at how your heart is affected, galvanic skin conductance, and electroencephalogram, how the brain waves are working. This was the test on how well you could reproduce these images from the textbook. An important aspect, especially if you're going to be a therapist working with people, is cultural assessment and developmental assessment. Really being aware of where your client is coming from culturally. And, for instance, mental health disorders, if a person is seeing their grandmother or grandfather and they've been passed away for several years, we would probably say that they're in psychosis. However, if you are a Native American, and I'm assessing that, then it's more common for them to see or believe that their ancestors are influencing or communicating with them in the present, even if they've been long past. And so it's really an important aspect of culture when we're doing therapy and assessment. And of course, my undergrad was actually in human development, and I nearly have a master's in child development. And so it's really important to understand the different aspects of human development and how that influences mental health and behaviors. So when you do get your opportunity, if you haven't had it already, to take your human development course, really pay attention to how human development impacts a person's mental health. And so, again, cultural formulation, looking at the cultural identity of the client, language, etc., cultural ideas of distress. For instance, we are an individualistic society, and so somebody who comes from a collective society may very well become distressed by moving over here to America from another culture by themselves, because they're used to interdependence and dependence on their fellow members of culture. Over here, it's kind of, do your own thing and hope you survive. And so that distress may be even greater than for somebody who is just moving out on their own in Kentucky. So these are the types of things that we want to be considering when we're meeting with somebody. Cultural factors related to the social environments. Again, looking somebody in the eye during therapy. If you're American and your culture is American, then we're used to direct eye contact. However, if you're from other cultures like Japan, for instance, um, that is a sign of disrespect to look somebody in the eyes continually. So those are different things. Cultural influences on the relationship between the client and the mental health professional. Always want to be aware of these things and um, over cultural assessment. So summarizing all these factors and looking into the treatment of the individual. 3 basic steps. Uh, for the scientific method, we generate a hypothesis, develop a research design, and then analyze and interpret data to test the hypothesis. You're going to get more of this in a separate research course, but a research design, an experiment is a research design that allows us to draw cause and effect. And so a true experiment, we're able to determine causality. We have a hypothesis, we have independent and dependent variables. The uh, dependent variable depends on the manipulation of the independent variable. So that's an easy way to remember the difference between independent and dependent. So the independent variable is what we're manipulating to see how it affects the dependent variable, what relies on that. Randomization uh, is an important aspect, and there's lots of ways to do randomization. Experimental and control groups are often vital, especially when we're looking at mental health and treatments, etc. And then, of course, external and internal validity. So there's 2 other types of validity that weren't in the previous discussion. The external validity is how well it matches the real world environment. Internal validity is great, we can control for these things and we get this result, but how well does that internal validity from the lab apply to the outside world? And so you might have really great research that's done in a lab with a lot of controlled variables, but that may not always translate necessarily out to the real world. Again, also, what's the population of that you're using? Is it heterogeneous? Is it really varied and diverse, or is it homogeneous and very similar? You know, so you want to take that into consideration, especially when you're reading research. You want to see who was it done on and how consistent and how similar was everybody. I mean, because if you're working with that group, then it's going to apply. But if you're working with a diverse group, it may not always apply the research. So correlational studies, again, correlational studies, these are not causality studies. These are just looking at the relationship of one variable to the other. In this example here, we have a +1 perfect relationship for every uh, one of these that goes across, it goes up 1 as well. So we have a perfect 45-degree line. This one is going to be a moderate effect. If you drew a straight line through here, you would see this slope, or this ratio, which is ultimately the slope. Then this, you can see there's no way to draw any line that would make sense in this. They're all kind of randomly spaced, evenly spaced out, and so these are unrelated. Quasi-experimental designs, these by the name are hard, but people will draw causation out of a quasi-experiment. They would be wrong, but they will do that. In some ways, it's maybe you just can't randomize things, or you have a set group. That's how we get quasi-experimental. It's different mixed designs, and again, they're often using comparisons and correlations, which means that we cannot draw causation out of it, but we can draw some conclusions. These quasi-experimental methods tend to be really good at predicting things. So again, looking at that relationship and then applying it to future research. other alternative experimental designs, a natural experiment, just naturally observing people in their environment and doing it in that natural environment. An analog experiment, single subject experiments, working with just one individual. Um, those are the different designs there. Looking at developmental designs, we have longitudinal studies. Emmy Werner, she is a superhero in resiliency development or research, and she has followed a group of individuals. The study she's passed, but the study is still going on even today because that original group of people is still alive. They've been studied now since the 50s. So it's a study that's been going on for 70 years, following this group of people all the way through their life. It's pretty amazing. Cross-sectional studies, looking at maybe going to like a school, and you're going to look at second, fourth, sixth, eighth, and 10th graders. That's going to be the study at one point in time, looking at it developmentally and trying to pull information out from that. And then the last one is a sequential design, which is a cross-sectional design that goes on for a little bit of time. It's not quite long enough to be a longitudinal study, but you're going to take that cross-sectional idea, the two second, fourth, sixth, eighth, and 10th graders, and you're going to follow them maybe for a year or for 6 months or something like that, and to see whatever the research that you're doing, whatever variables. And so those are developmental designs. And those will be on the test, by the way. And some of the experimental designs will be on the test as well. There'll be on this, there'll be a test on, or in the test, correlational studies. So if you haven't taken the test, you'll see that stuff is on there. So case study, single person, really detailed observations, and you spend a lot of time. Like I said, when it comes to research, you really want to be a wise consumer. Don't just because it got published does not mean that it's necessarily good research. Now there are higher level journals that produce really good research, and then there are some that aren't so much. And really want to make sure that you are a good consumer. And so that is chapter 4. Any questions? All right. Let's see. So then we'll jump into chapter 5. All right, so finally we made it to disorders, and we're going to start off in chapter 5 with anxiety disorders. So we have the worry, anxiety, fear, and we're just going to look through this. Most of this, obviously, most of it is in your book, or all of it's in your book, but also look at the DSM-5 as you go through each of these chapters too. For the most part, it's kind of just copied right out of the DSM-5, but probably the best thing to do as you read your books is look at the different stories that they actually show of individuals and their experiences, because that's going to give you the scenarios that you might actually come across as you work with people. So anxiety is an emotional state that occurs as a threatening event draws close. And again, individuals determine whether or not an event is threatening. What might not be threatening for somebody may be very threatening to somebody else. There's 3 key elements. And again, we're looking at physical feelings, the thoughts, and behaviors. So those are dimensional, if you remember from chapter 4. And this is, of course, the anxiety diagnosis is categorical. So all these things that we're looking at today will fall into the purview of anxiety. A panic attack, like it says, is not necessarily the diagnosing part of it. There's not a code for um, panic attack, but it is a part of um, other disorders. So that's why they go over it um, here. So looking at the different experiences of the individual, these 13 different experiences, in order to count as a panic attack, the individual um, has to have um, an abrupt surge of intense fear or intense discomfort that reaches a peak within minutes, so it's very short, at which time 4 or more of the following symptoms occur. So it doesn't matter which 4 of these occurs. It has to be a surge of intense fear, and then 4 of these have to occur. They may have more than 4, but they have to have a minimum of 4. And as you go through and you'll see these diagnoses, that there's a minimum often of symptoms that have to occur, or there's a minimum of length of time that the symptoms have to occur. And all of them, there has to be some impact in the individual's life. Because if they're experiencing this, but it doesn't affect their life, then it doesn't affect their life, and it's not a diagnosable issue. If socially, emotionally, mentally, and physically they are doing okay, even if they have some of these symptoms, there's not really any impact, then it's not a diagnosing, not diagnosable. Um, a caveat to though is just because they say that it doesn't impact their life doesn't mean that it doesn't. So, for instance, substance abuse. A lot of times the individual will say that it's not a big deal, it doesn't impact their life, but from the outside you can see how it's really impacting their life. So the panic attack is, again, we just went over that, so I'm not going to changes in the body sensation, something bad is happening, panic attack. Panic disorder is you must have at least one panic attack in the previous month, and then you also have to be concerned about having another one. And if there's not that concern and you just have one panic attack and then 6 months or a month later you have another panic attack, then you're okay if you're not weren't concerned. Um, they become concerned about having an additional panic attack or the consequences out of it. And sometimes, of course, they feel like they're dying, but um, they're not likely to die from the panic attack. So, agoraphobia, again, it's a phobia, so it's looking at marked fear or anxiety about 2 or more of the following 5 situations. So, public transportation, being in open spaces, being in closed spaces. Not necessarily claustrophobia, though. Standing in line or being in a crowd, and being outside of the home alone. Now, in general, I have a fear of public transportation. I use it if I need to, but I really don't like to use it. Um, so some of you, as you go through and you read through these different diagnoses, you're going to be like, I have that. You may have a fear of public transportation, but it doesn't prevent you from using it. If it does prevent you from using it, or you avoid using it because of other things, then that's a different story. Just like I don't like standing in line or being in a crowd. I mean, I physically don't like it, but I can do it. So I have 2 of those that would be for agoraphobia, but my dislike or my fear of that doesn't keep me from participating in my life and doing those things that if I needed to do those things, I can do them. Again, the individual fears or avoids these situations. Uh, almost always provoke fear or anxiety. C, and you can just read through. I'm not going to, unless there's any questions, I'm not going to spend a lot of time just reading what you can read. Um, Social anxiety disorder is another one, social phobia. I think a lot of us kind of go through a phase, especially in high school, after we reach puberty. We have that false idea that everybody's watching us. And so some of us outgrow that and some of us don't. And some of us go on to develop social anxiety disorder. Specific phobias. And again, these are actually all going to be on the test too. Not all of them. Some of them will be as far as like a matching. Generalized anxiety disorder. You can't really put a finger on why you're feeling anxious, but you often feel anxious or worried about something or some things. And it can be several things all at the same time. You might be worried about your children. You might be worried about school. You might be worried about all these things to the extent that we have these feelings and you've been having them for more days than not. So 5 days out of the week or 4 days out of the week for the past 6 months. There is, again, right here's a perfect example of having 3 or more of the 6 symptoms with at least some of the symptoms having been present for more days than not for the past 6 months. And so you have to really consider all of the data that you're given in order to decide which disorder it is. And so on the test, you get a practice matching. I put little scenarios in there for you to match with the different disorders. And so be careful though, because some of them, if they don't meet the criteria, won't be that disorder. And it's often going to be the time. So the thoughts are persistent, uncontrollable worry across several domains, and it can actually be physical, restlessness, fatigue, etc. Obsessive compulsive disorder. Again, these are recurrent persistent thoughts, or the individual attempts to ignore, suppress these thoughts with some other thought or action. Compulsions, right? So you can have mental compulsions like counting, you can have physical compulsions like knocking, anything that's trying to help assuage these recurrent or persistent thoughts, urges, or images. And this woman obviously trimming her grass with a pair of scissors several hours every day. Obsessions are those, and they will either with or without the compulsion. Body dysmorphic disorder, a preoccupation with one or more perceived defects or flaws in physical appearance that are not observable or appear slight to others. And so at some point during the course of the disorder, the individual has performed repetitive behaviors, mirror checking, excessive grooming, skin picking, etc., or comparing their mental acts with comparing his or her appearance with that of others. So, post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a long one, and this is for children 6 years or older, and all the way through adulthood, adolescence, etc. So when we look at these symptoms, that's what this is for. And as you go through, then you also have specifications for some symptoms or for some disorders. So it might have depersonalization, persistent or recurrent experience of feeling detached from even yourself. Now, we experience that a lot, right? Just driving down the road on a regular route that you always take every day. Sometimes you jump in your car and you're before you know it, you're at work and you didn't even realize that you drove 20 miles. It's not uncommon for people to depersonalize in different situations, especially when we're doing those things automatically. Sometimes we have derealization, which is a persistent or recurrent experience of unreality of surroundings. The world around the individual is experienced as unreal, dreamlike, or distant, distorted. And so those two are separate things. One has to do with the individual, the other one has to do with their environment. So if, like after an accident, the last one with delayed expression, if after the accident nothing happens, they're living their life normal, and then at least after 6 months, that's when the onset starts. That is a delayed expression. And then these are the criterion for the children 6 years and younger. So technically, it's what I said earlier was a little bit off. It was for 7-year-olds through adolescence through adulthood. And so this one is specifically for children aged 6 or younger. Traumatic events, I mean, the news is full of traumatic events. People can actually become traumatized and have post-traumatic stress from observing the traumatic events seen on television. Um, in my lifetime, when the Twin Towers went down, America was glued to the television set. And even though people weren't living in New York, some of them experienced post-traumatic stress disorder just by watching the terror events happening and unfolding on the television as everything was being filmed live. And so directly experiencing it, witnessing the event, learning that an event occurred to a close family or member, and this is where especially repeated exposure to details of traumatic events. So there's 4 clusters of symptoms: intrusion, can't keep the thoughts from going there; effortful avoidance, avoiding situations. If a car accident happened here, then I might go way out of my way to avoid that car accident, the place where the car accident happened. Changes in cognition and mood, and arousal or anxiety, so kind of being on edge. Acute distress disorder is that, obviously, this list of symptoms, but also the event itself is 3 days to 1 month after the event. If it lasts longer than that, then it becomes post-traumatic stress disorder. So all these symptoms are part of that. And here you can see just the timeline. Again, the timeline makes all the difference. Separation anxiety disorder. And so it can be for children and for adults. A lot of times we look at separation anxiety disorder as just being for children. However, it's consistent and possible to have for adults to have it as well. And so looking at the epidemiology of the anxiety disorders, college students focus, addressing the stigma, especially anxiety disorders, because they may already have the cognitions that people are looking at them or worried that people are looking at them. So they may experience the stigma even at a greater level. Looking at the biological risk factors for the test, it's important to know different risk factors for the anxiety disorders, and also environmental, etc. Anxiety sensitivity, fear of the potential dangerousness of one's own internal sensations. So dizziness and increased heart rate. Cognitive distortions that contribute to anxiety, jumping to conclusions, catastrophizing, emotional reasoning. Learning experiences. We can learn to deal with fear and anxiety. We can also learn to avoid it. We can do all kinds of things according to classical conditioning behavioral stuff. The causes of anxiety disorders: biological vulnerabilities, early problematic interactions with anxious parents, so poor attachment, etc., difficulties in elementary school, and difficulties in middle high school. So reading through that, the book does cover prevention of these disorders and helping kids grow up with confidence. And obviously, for like accidents and near-death things, you can't really prepare for that, but you can help them get over it through treatment, etc. And so the assessment, there are many tools out there, many instruments that we can use for assessing anxiety disorders. The biological treatment, of course, medication, benzodiazepines, or Xanax, etc., which are addictive, can be hard, especially risk of substance abuse and dependence, lots of side effects accordingly, and um, it doesn't, biological treatment does not get to the root of the issue. So it does help people get to a point where they can do counseling and then get to the root, but medication alone does not address the root. So here's a great um, list of the different treatments. Cognitive therapy, changing the way that we think. Exposure based, so desensitization, behavioral. Mindfulness, which tends to be along the lines of DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. Um, Screening for it, long-term outcome for people, uh, treatment compliance and completion, longer treatment, especially with exposure, better social skills, social support, less severe trauma and anxiety symptoms, fewer stressful life events. So pretty good outcomes for anxiety when people are willing to work on that. All right. Um, any questions?